Hello, Oracles. Today we're going to be taking a look at NVIDIA stock and the S&P 500. We're going to take a look at a potential if we get into a recession next year or we see some sort of downturn in the stock market, how far could these fall? We're going to be taking a look at strictly gap stock analysis. This is something that I've done with Tesla, and we looked back 2 years and we filled up most of those gaps over the last 2 years when Tesla collapsed back down in 2022. Most people didn't believe it was ever going to happen. Most people thought we would never get below certain levels, and sure enough, we still did. So today we're going to be taking a look at the exact same thing when it comes to NVIDIA and the S&P 500. Now, before we get into this is all just based upon stock charts, strictly looking at the gaps. Nothing says that we have to come down and fill these gaps. Historically, gaps fill 9 out of 10 times. And so based off of historical data, it's something to just pay attention to see if it's actually going to come to fruition. And that's just one of the things that I want to take a look at here today is what are the potentials? If we do end up falling down, what potential levels could we end up falling to in both NVIDIA and the entire S&P 500? Now, again, in the past, we saw these gaps and we're like, well, what could possibly bring us down to those levels? The fundamentals looked good. Were we overvalued a little bit? And almost every single time, just like recessions, something ends up triggering it out of nowhere. Something that was completely unexpected could trigger it. Now, in this case, I do anticipate a recession based upon unemployment data going up. And we're looking at unemployment data going up, inflation kind of being a little sticky at the moment right now at these levels, not going back up, but it's not going down either. So we've got some inflation problems that are maybe sticking around that people thought was squashed. And we have unemployment that is going up. And if Trump ends up doing what he wants to do and cuts a bunch of government jobs that are out there, even if they do go and they give 2-year stipends to a lot of these employees and they help them find other jobs that are out there, if there aren't jobs out there at the moment, unemployment could end up escalating even higher, thereby showing us a recession that in turn would scare the market even more. That could bring the stock prices down. That could be the trigger that brings us down to some of these levels. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at today is just what levels do we have that are out there right now? If a lot of these things end up playing out, what could we get pulled down to? Now, gaps do go in both directions. Right now, we're pushing at all-time highs, so there's really no gaps above us from what we're looking at today. But if we do end up pulling down and we gap down, those are gaps to look at on the way back up that we could fill as well. All right, so starting off with NVIDIA, and I'm going to go back 2 years on this because, again, Tesla went back 2 years and filled a lot of those gaps, and we've seen a massive run-up in the last 2 years, so I'm not going to say that anything is impossible. So first gap that we have here that was created on October 3rd goes down to the 119.38 level. Very small gap, but this is the first gap we would see on the way down. Next gap below that is very tiny, down at the $86 level. That was created back on May 3rd of this year. And going back to February 21st of this year, again, this is still within 1 year, we have a gap that goes down to 68.87. And then prior to that, we have a couple of small gaps earlier in that February, one of them on February 2nd at 63.18, and then one of them on January 23rd at 59.90. And now again, going back just a little over 1 year, we have a gap that goes down to 42.37, and then the massive gap that we have down to the $30.59 level that goes back to May 24th of 2023. So those are all of the gaps going back over the last year and a half, basically, on NVIDIA stock. And now again, none of these are guaranteed to fill. Gaps fill 9 out of 10 times, but if we're looking, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 gaps that we have that go back about a year and a half. And if gaps fill 9 out of 10 times, that's 7 gaps there. So you guys can let me know in the comments below. Do you think we're going to fill any of these gaps? Why do you think we would fill them if we do? Could it be an overall market pull down? Could it be something where maybe NVIDIA hits the wall when it comes to growth because all the companies have what they're looking for and they don't need the hardware right away? Maybe it's because of the recession and they don't want to spend their money. You guys can let me know in the comments below what you think could potentially cause some of these gaps to fill and how low do you think NVIDIA could potentially fall? And also let me know, do you think any of them will fill, or do you think we're just going to continue to go up from here? And now we'll look at the S&P 500. This is the entire market. I'm going to use VOO, VOO, as our sample for this because that is the ETF that tracks the S&P 500, and this is the one that I own myself. So looking at some of the gaps here, and like I said, you can have gaps above us, and this we sure do have a gap above us. We have a gap that goes up to the 544.88 level. So that one is above us, and again, chances are, knowing the stock market over time goes up and to the right. So historically, we will always be going up if that continues. So this gap will get filled. The question would be is, does this get filled before we fill the gaps below us? Or do we fill the gaps below us first and then come back up to fill this afterwards? Again, that's a question that only time will answer. Now, going back below us, we've got a gap down here that was created after the election on November 5th. We've got that gap down to 530.17. Prior to that, we have a tiny little gap that goes down to 512.54 that was created on September 12th. Prior to that, a tiny little gap on August 12th that goes down to 490.82. Then you go back to May 2nd of this year and you have a gap down to 461.87. Continue back to February, we've got on the 2nd a gap down to 445.25. Tiny little gap at the 439.25 on January 19th. Then you go back to November of last year, where we have this gap at 399.86. And if you guys remember, this is where at the end of October, we saw a massive jump. It was basically the bottom of the market in 2023. And then we've been basically straight up from there with a couple of dips along the way. And after that jump there, we also created a gap at 390.41 on November 2nd, and then one again on November 1st at 383.68. And if you pull back earlier into 2023, May 4th, you have one at 366.07, a tiny little one here on March 30th down to 361.01, and then another one here on March 28th at 356.38. And now some of these gaps do coincide with NVIDIA's gaps because sometimes when the S&P 500 jumps up, as do some of the larger companies, especially those in the Magnificent Seven, those are the heaviest weighted stocks that are out there. And because those are the heaviest weighted, S&P jumps, those jumper. In many cases, those jump and the S&P jumps with it because they are so heavily weighted. So these are just some of the things to pay attention to when it comes to the downside potentials. Now, the S&P had a lot smaller gaps that were in it, but they are gaps nonetheless. So again, none of this is guaranteed. It doesn't mean that because we have gaps below us, we are going to pull down and fill those gaps. But we haven't had a real good, clean pullback, anything like a real good correction in a little while. And so it is healthy for the market to go through that. And we haven't had a prolonged recession either. We had the recession that happened from COVID, but that was very short-lived. We haven't had a long, drawn-out, just kind of market-wide, economy-wide cleansing that actually helps the market and helps the economy. We haven't had one of those since the Great Financial Crisis. So I know it really sucks to go through times like that, especially for most of us, because people at the top basically don't feel it. They don't notice those kinds of things. It's the working man that really ends up feeling the brunt of all of this. But at the end of the day, for the health of the economy, for the health of the stock market, it is something that's important to go through. Especially you look at something like the Russell 2000, and you have a significant chunk of those companies that are zombie companies. These are companies that don't even bring in enough revenue to pay off their debt interest, let alone their debts alone. So they're falling to the wayside, similar to where actually the US government is getting close to themselves, where they don't have enough money coming in to even pay the interest on their debts. This is something that Elon Musk and Trump have been talking about to kind of help that when it comes to the government. We'll see if that actually comes to fruition and plays out. But if they end up doing that, it will cause a lot of hardships in the short term, but it will be good for us in the long term. We just have to get through those hard times. And Elon has been kind of trying to prepare a lot of people for that by saying it's going to be difficult before it gets better. Again, we'll see how that's going to end up playing out. We'll see how they're able to help the people who they end up taking jobs away from in that process. But those difficult times are times that really help flourish. It's like doing, like I said, the spring cleaning in your house, or even for your own budget, going through a lot of the expenses that you have and be like, do I really need all of these subscriptions to all of these streaming services? Do I really need to bring in all these different groceries? Like, what do I have in my cabinets that maybe I haven't used? Maybe I can use some of that and not spend as much on other groceries that are out there because I have a lot that are kind of stockpiling up. Something that's very good and healthy to do for your own house, for your own budget. The government needs to go through that as well, and it'll be good for the entire stock market. And that in turn will end up bringing the entire stock market down. And that's where a lot of these companies like the Apples and the Berkshire Hathaways who have giant stockpiles of cash will go shopping for other companies that they're going to be buying to add to their own companies themselves, and they'll take them onto them. And so again, it'll be good for those companies. It'll be good for their companies to get stronger, and the strong will come out better on the other side. Tesla, NVIDIA, a lot of the Magnificent Seven, I think will be a lot of those companies that come out of this, but we have to go through that process first before we can come out on the other side. And again, with the stock market getting pulled down, could end up filling those gaps in that process. So that's just my thoughts on that. That's what I think could potentially happen over the next maybe 12 to 18 months. We will see what's going on. We'll take a look at those gaps. We'll track those on the way down. We may see the stock market continue to run up going into the inauguration of next year, closing out this year a little bit stronger before we get to that point of that market pulling down. Maybe we create some more gaps on the way up as well. Time will tell on that. We will take a look. But you guys let me know your thoughts in the comments below. How do you feel about all of those gaps that are in there? What other companies do you want me to track? I am going to be doing Palantir and the NASDAQ as well. That'll be coming out either later this week or next week. And there's many others that I know I want to get done. I'll do a bunch of my own as well. But you guys can let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What stocks do you want me to do gap analysis on? And I'll take a look at those also. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate all of your support. Have a great one.